Netherlands, and I'm invited here through Orissa in Lviv. And she invited us because we've been working in Lviv now for more than 6 years on the integrity of government. So what we're actually trying to do, which is kind of relevant for Ukraine, is to help in creating a non-corrupt government in Ukraine. And don't need to tell you that that is not easy. And the core of what we're doing, believe it or not, is to train civil servants in moral judgment. And we do a lot of other things too, like catching groups and all that kind of stuff. But the core of it is teaching civil servants moral judgment. Now, I'm not going to talk about that today, however, it would be very interesting also in the context of Odessa to talk about non-corrupt local government, but that's not the subject of today. We're talking about reconciliation and memory. And I'm going to add a third term. I'm going to talk about reconciliation, nationalism, and memory. And I think one of the problems is that this talk about reconciliation is very hot in the Ukraine, but it's not very precise. It's not saying reconciling who with whom, about what kind of conflict, at what moment in the conflict. Well, this morning we could at least see that there are 3 reconciliations at stake. The first would be the reconciliation with people who are already dead. The second would be internal reconciliation inside the territory of the Ukraine, including, but not only, the Donbass. And the third reconciliation that is in the air is the reconciliation not with Putin or his regime, but with the Russian people. So there are at least 3 reconciliations we're talking about. And I think it would help the debate and the thinking about reconciliation enormously if people would be precise about which of these 3 reconciliations they're actually talking about. Because reconciliation is not something abstract, it's something concrete you do in very concrete historical situations. My talk is going to be about the second. So the reconciliation between different groups and regions and communities inside Ukraine. Not that I don't think that what I'm going to say is also relevant for the 2 others, it is, but in an indirect way. I'm going to very shortly talk a bit about the theory of nationalism that has been developed in the last 50 years. And then very quickly make that relevant for the situation in the Ukraine now. And then connect that with reconciliation and memory. Right? So that is a bit the course of the lecture. First about nationalism, then making that relevant for the Ukraine, and then connecting that with reconciliation and memory. If you read the literature about nationalism, there is, especially in the English-speaking world, people speak about 2 types of nationalism. Civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. And of course, this being the English-speaking world has civic nationalism, and the rest of the world has ethnic nationalism. And of course, the civic nationalism is superior to the ethnic nationalism. That goes without saying. So you have 2 types. One is the British-American type, and then you have basically the continental, as the British say it, type, because the rest of the world hasn't even got to nations, right? You can feel the condescending way of talking that is inherent in this speech, 2 types. I don't think that that is right. I think what we have is not 2 types, but 2 phases of nationalism. I think nationalism, and I will come back to that, always starts as ethnic. And if everything goes well, it goes on to become civic. Now that movement is forever onshore. So there can be regression from a civic to an ethnic nationalism, and even a stable civic nationalism has within itself, as a kind of ghost, the ethnic nationalism. You can never completely get rid of it. So, not two types, but an historical development that is precarious, that is forever haunted by the first phase, and can regress to that first phase. I think that describes much more the reality of what is happening in the world than the idea of two types, and then the Anglo-Saxon type. Which also means, by the way, I'm not going to talk about that today, but that the American so-called civil nationalism has an ethnic nationalism within it, but unrecognized. And actually it's about whiteness. The hidden ethnic nationalism in the civic nationalism of the United States is being white. That's what haunts that civic nationalism. Now, if we bring this to the Ukraine, this idea of not types, but a development, you see something both remarkable and interesting, and also very, very dangerous and difficult. If I, for a second, may look at my own country, the Netherlands, that was definitely an ethnic nationalism in the beginning. We fought for 80 years a war against the Spanish. And we insisted that we were different because of language, because of geography, and because of religion. Protestantism versus Catholicism. And we insisted on the right, on that basis of that difference, to create a nation. Fought 80 years for it, and created that nation. Now, if you would ask now, Dutchmen, if they would recognize themselves in the description of ethnic nationalism, they would say, no, we are not, in that sense, ethnic. It also, of course, has nothing to do with the historical reality of the Netherlands. The Netherlands, from the beginning that it became a nation, paradoxically, became an immigration country. And the complete wealth of the Netherlands is actually based on those immigrations. If I may refer to my own profession, philosophy, there is one great philosopher in the Dutch tradition, and that is Spinoza, and he's a Portuguese Jew. Right? But that shows that this is not really true, even though it started. But we have now become a completely civic national nation, based on a civic nationalism nation, and people would even be embarrassed if you would refer to them as ethnic Dutch, right? Now, that doesn't mean we cannot regress. For example, after the World Trade Center in New York was destroyed, and we have a big Muslim immigration, which went actually quite well, but as all immigrations go very slow, it takes about 3 generations to integrate people, and it doesn't go faster, whatever you do, it takes simply 3 generations, right? So it is also, but because of what happened there was this worry about Muslims. I think it's shared in the whole world, and you saw this kind of regression, right? So, very funny fact, the first cabinet after 9/11 in the Netherlands had 3 male Protestants who were sons of, how do you say that in English, dominees. Anybody? Yeah, but Protestant priests. So, pastors, 3 sons of pastors made up the main ministries of the cabinet. Strange, right? But like we again thought, but if we're in a crisis, what can be trusted are male Protestants. Well, it didn't work, of course. Right? We ended that after an experiment of 4 years. But even this very secular, very civic nation, the Netherlands, has these moments of regression, which shows that you never can really totally get rid of the ethnic within the civic. Right? But if you look at that history, that we started as perfectly ethnic and ended up as very, very civic, it took us about 3 300 years, that journey. Now to the Ukraine. Ukraine simply does not have this luxury to take 300 years. It's what you see in everything in Ukraine is this time is compressed. This is a very young nation, not a young people. It's an old people, but it's a very young nation. It's 25 years old. This is absolutely nothing. So many Ukrainians always think things are going too slow. And this is ridiculous. Where you have come in 25 years is unbelievable. People after Maidan even, right? There's a new government, how long? Exactly. How long is Poroshenko?
1 year.
1 year! 1 year. And people are telling me that things are going too slow after Maidan. They're going lightning fast in an historical perspective. They're going lightning fast. Right? So, very young nation, living on the conditions of compressed time, has to do many things at once, cannot do them one by the other. And the same goes for the construction of the nation, which of course, for a young nation, is in a sense the most important thing you have to do. You have to construct your nation. And you do that intellectually and you do it by actions. So for example, you could look at the war with Putin now as the real independence war. Right? If we're honest, we became independent in '90 by a kind of fluke. Right? You didn't fight for that. You didn't force that. You didn't create that. If I'm very, very bad, I'm saying that it was because the KGB part of Ukraine thought that they would become quicker, richer, if they would become independent than if they would stay under the KGB of Russia, right? Yeah, but I think personally, I think inside that it was the KGB who actually was doing it. But anyway, it weren't the citizens of the Ukraine who did that. The independence was a kind of gift. And now we are at the point of earning that gift. That's actually where you are. So time is compressed, and time is also not simply linear in the situation where you are. That means that if you observe what happens in Ukraine through the lens of this idea of development from ethnic to civic, you actually see that the ethnic and the civic are created at the same time in Ukraine and are in a kind of competition with each other. The ethnic idea could win, or the civic idea could win. But actually there are elements of both under construction all the time. Now very shortly about ethnic nationalism. Why is it that the creation of nations usually starts in an ethnic way? Because it's necessary. And let me try to explain that necessity. If you go from an empire, basically an empire where you have many peoples, and it is in some form autocratic, not democratic. When you move from an empire to democracy, the emperor always disintegrates, and nations come. Now, a democratic nation is completely different from the autocratic empire in one vital way. You have to trust your fellow citizens, which you didn't need to do in empire. In empire, you basically trusted your family, maybe your community, in the sense of village or God, but you didn't trust the citizen. In a democracy, you have to trust the citizen, because together you're building this nation, right? You are actually together deciding policies. You're absolutely dependent on that the majority of citizens follows the law. If they don't, it doesn't work, right? Now, this trust has historically no basis in the empire itself. There's no historical experience with it, no narratives about it, so it's out of the blue. Now, if you speak the same language as the others, if you have the same historical experiences, if you share the same space, if you have the same religion, that trust is much easier than if you don't have these things in common. So the reason why nationalism always begins is the problem of trust that is partially solved by being the same in many aspects. So that we know that now, enormous historical investigation, this gets then this fact, because this is factual, we speak the same language, we have the same religion, we are family related, we live in the same region, this is all facts. But these facts get embroidered into what in the literature beautifully is called an imaginary community. So the nation is actually imagined. And in this imaginary community, this construction, the past becomes vital. It's past events that create this imaginary community, right? So a very partial history is always an element of the construction of an ethnic identity for nationality, right? Now, okay, what is the problem with that? Well, I'll come to the Ukraine in a second, but in itself, ethnic nationalism is unstable because the definition of who belongs and who doesn't is always the problem. It is not only unstable, it is inherently dangerous. And it's dangerous on the inside and towards the outside. And that is because the ethnic nationality creates the minority. Because the minority didn't exist in empire. There were no minority. But in ethnic nationalism, because you define the majority as being the ethnic nation, you create minorities. So then there are Romanians in Ukraine, if you have it. And there are, and because you create minorities, depending on how virulent the ethnic nationalism becomes, you at the end have the possibility of ethnic cleansing, genocide. As a solution of the unity problem, the ethnic definition itself creates. But it's also very, very dangerous to the outside, and that is all because there are always ethnic national citizens who actually live outside of the border. So shouldn't they be brought into the nation? Don't they deserve to be part of that nation? Isn't that historically right to do so? Isn't that the correction of an historical mistake, right? To bring them back into our nation. So ethnic nationalism, both on the inside and towards the outside, is inherently dangerous. And that is not something theoretically, that is something we've seen in European history again and again and again. Now, how does the development from ethnic to civic go? Well, that's actually more easy to understand because through ethnic nationalism, you create a nation, which means a monopoly of violence with a certain territory, that you then bring under democratic control. And then, instead of the imaginary community of the ethnic nation, it comes into being a real community of citizens who share a state, who share the democratic, the fight to control in a democratic way that state, and then share what this state is doing and not doing. So have a common, from that point on, have a real common history, a real common destiny, shared experiences, real dependencies. So there comes a real community. But that community is no longer ethnic, because what is at the basis of that community is that we share the same state and share the same democratic system. So from the ethnic, you move the imaginary community of the ethnic, you move to the real community of the citizens, right? Now, that civic is not without its dangers. For example, it can be quite aggressive to the outside, but it's more stable and less dangerous than the ethnic version. Now again, back to the Ukraine, where both are under construction at the same time. If you want to construct the Ukraine on an ethnic basis, look at it, then it cannot be constructed at all. So, let's list it. So you have to have the same language. Well, there we go. I didn't notice that we spoke a lot of Ukrainian today, right? We did. No. So you have a big problem. Am I right in saying that maybe it's even more Russian speakers in Ukraine? I'm not allowed to sort it in the rest of Ukraine, but think that there are even more Russian speaking.
All of Ukraine can understand Russian.
Yeah, but how many are primarily Russian speaking? How much of the population? No, in the whole of Ukraine, what are you saying?
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows. Yeah, this is such a fact. Nobody wants to know, right? Nobody wants to know. Let's say it's 50-50.
We have different point of how to calculate it.
Yeah, of course.
Till the 11 million population to the 83% of Ukrainian citizens at all.
Yeah, so this is of course,
To 30 million.
this is of course a contested fact. It's a contested fact because it's contested between the civic and the ethnic construction of the nation. Right? That's why it's a contested fact. So that's language. Let's look at religion. This is only one religion, right, in the Ukraine. Not gonna work, right? So geography, also such a very interesting subject in the Ukraine, right? The borders of the Ukraine, right? If you look at historically, right, it could have been all over the place, right? It's more or less a coincidence how the borders are now, right? More or less a coincidence how they are now. So in the Ukrainian situation, the ethnic construction of nationalism is actually, even compared to other places, extremely unstable and therefore extremely dangerous. Right? Now imagine you would really want to ethnically construct the Ukraine. And many people have to work. This is about half the population. You have to get rid of that, right? Well, one solution would be to invite Putin in, let them take the east part of the country and take Ukraine out of the rest, right? So, the reason why this ethnic construction comes up nevertheless is again the same point. It's easier to trust each other when you speak the same language, have the same, are part of the same geographic community. And it's happening all over the place, but it's not possible to construct a nation out of it in the Ukrainian situation. So, you have to move towards the civic solution, rather more quickly than other nations have to do. That is what's producing this compressed time. The interesting thing about that is that this articulation of a nation is actually something where intellectuals have a very big role. Usually they are doing that. So it's actions that are doing that. For example, being at war with Putin has united the Ukraine much more than anything else has. Right? Maidan has united the Ukraine in many, many ways. So actions are very important. But then come the interpretations of the actions and the articulation of what being Ukrainian actually is. Now, remember, even in the Netherlands, the ethnic original root of the nation never disappears and is always hauntingly present. That goes for the Ukraine as well. So a civic construction is necessary, but it will only work if this civic construction actually pays homage to this ethnic root. And that is a real homage, not something fake. To put it as a Dutch observer, in a bit crude way, because we Dutch are always rude, very direct people. It's because these stubborn Ukrainian peasants that never could conquer their own cities, nevertheless kept speaking Ukrainian, stubbornly having their own religion, keeping again and again rebelling, even against Stalin. the only people who ever did, that we can talk about the Ukraine as a nation. So without this ethnic root, there would be no reason, no possibility to talk about a Ukrainian nation. And that is something the other communities in the Ukraine that are not ethnically Ukrainian have to acknowledge. So for example, the struggle about language is not just one side. It's not just like the Ukrainians wanting to force everybody to speak Ukrainian, which is kind of ridiculous, but it's always also the other side. There is a real question for everybody wanting to be a Ukrainian citizen. If not at least, he should be very fluent in Ukrainian as a second language, as a kind of acknowledgement that it are really the Ukrainians, in an ethnic sense, that made the Ukrainian nation possible. And well, many other forms that this homage. Now, two last remarks. One about the role of memory in this. I already said that ethnic nationalistic narrative has a very strong relationship to history, but it's partial. So only certain facts will be readily omitted. The civic one has the beauty of being able of welcoming all facts and all events. Because it's actually only saying everything that happened in the Ukraine that we are now constructing is part of Ukrainian history. So in what we've been talking about this morning, being on the side of historical truth is at the same time being on the side of a civic construction of national identity. So you don't need to be counter-partial. You only have to be on the side of historical truth. And in that sense, the work that this conference is doing of philosophers and historians is a very important part of the construction of a civic national identity for Europe. Last thought is about Odessa, where we are. Beautiful city, by the way. But a very specific city, right? With a very specific identity that could be summed up in the text, Odessa is Odessa is Odessa. Right? This is a civic identity. Watch it. Not of a country, of a nation, but of a city. Odessa is a civic identity of a city. In that, Odessa is enormously important in the Ukraine. Because the Ukraine cannot, on an ethnic basis, integrate Odessa. If it wants Odessa to be a part of the Ukraine, it has to construct itself in a civic way. So there is not just beauty, but importance in this line, Odessa is Odessa is Odessa. So by staying Odessa, you're actually helping the Ukraine become civic. But there is another sign of this. Odessa in its history has only committed itself to itself. And that was right. You were simply part of different empires and kept yourself alive. And created a decent living basically by smuggling. For everybody in this city. Great. But if you become part of a democratic state, if that happens, and that's still unsure, because on the way, but if that happens, that Odessa keeps to itself is no longer enough. In this process, Odessa has to commit itself to a democratic Ukraine, and has in that sense add something to this Odessa is Odessa is Odessa. It has to become Odessa is Odessa is Odessa is a Ukrainian city. Thank you very much.
Спасибо, уважаемые коллеги. вопросы по докладу, может быть, есть, нам пока регламент позволяет. Хоть несколько вопросов по изложенному. Есть ли желающие? Да, пожалуйста.
Wait a second, I'll have to reoperate this.
Yes.
Yeah.
My question in Russian, so я бы хотела задать такой вопрос, потому что вы говорили о нации и об этнических группах, об этносе, но дело в том, что вот интересно само понятие нации, потому что оно достаточно противоречивое, очень много разных философов говорят о разных смыслах нации, и в Украине сейчас сложилась такая ситуация, когда, например, недавно вышел фильм в Украине, он еще малоизвестен, называется «Украина полиэтническая». Как...
В чем вопрос? Я послушала.
Она еще не задала. Еще просто там все перебрать.
В чем вопрос?
В котором рассказывается о том, что очень много у нас в Украине наций, и все, в принципе, вернее, очень много этнических групп, как диаспор, которые, в принципе, себя еще отождествляют как украинцы. То есть они считают себя принадлежащими к той этнической группе, но при этом считают себя украинцами, гражданами Украины, и считают, что они, в принципе, являются частью Украины. С другой стороны, у нас есть ситуация, например, как вот в некотором роде вот этот радикальный национализм, радикальная, скажем так, или вернее даже не радикальная, но иногда бывает такая крайняя точка зрения, когда украинцы немножко себя как бы, вот именно коренные украинцы, диаспора этническая, немножко как бы переходят границы. И тут возникает вопрос вообще, что же такое нация в этом контексте. Является ли нация это только той же этнической группой, или все-таки нация это нечто большее, чем этническая группа или государство? Ну, здесь немножко то, что то есть как бы тут вроде как бы и да, и нет. Просто если можно...
Так все лекции в этом.
Надо было еще, наверное, ввести третье понятие folk, nation, folk, civic.
Well, your question goes precisely to what is at stake, right? I would say both versions you present, the one in the film and the nationalistic one, are wrong. The nationalistic one is the ethnic reconstruction, right? So Ukrainians is the nation of Ukrainians, and who is a Ukrainian? Someone who has the language, the right religion, the right parents, the right region, the right history, right? Okay. But polyethnic is not really true. Not that there are not many ethnic communities, certainly. But if you look at it, really, then the Ukrainian ethnic community is the biggest, and also the one reason why can a nation be constructed. So it's also not true to suggest that there would be a kind of equality between all these different ethnicities. Therefore, the really idea that helps you further is the idea that the nation should not be constructed on an ethnic basis, but on a civic one. Because then you have neither to defend it as polyethnic, nor as singularly ethnic. You simply say, everybody who is a citizen of the Ukraine is therefore a Ukrainian. But, again, I think where the pain lies is in to acknowledge that without the Ukrainian ethnicity, the construction of this civic nation would not be possible.
And Professor Delara wants to make some remarks and to leave question.
Yes, thank you. I find your scheme of the continuity between two opposed poles, ethnic and civic, very illuminating, but I think it must be qualified by the difference between the stories, the specificity of each nation history. For instance, France began more or less as a civic nation through the Gallo-Roman concept, the German-Latin combination. As Netherlands, it became an empire nation, and I think that it's a key of the history of both our countries we should not forget. And if we look at Ukrainian history, I wouldn't say that the nation building of Ukraine is so recent, because there is a long, unsuccessful, but very active history of struggle for independence against empire, and except at the short moment of the 30s, this tradition was always rather more civic than ethnic, because Ukraine has always been multicultural and multi-religious. And for instance, the First Republic after the First World War, despite huge difficulties with Red Army, White Army, it's a very fragile regime who happened to fall very fast, spent a lot of energy to build a democratic constitution based on a civic nation and democratic autonomy of the minorities. And there was even a law for there was not only a recognition of the 4 big minorities, but big groups, Ukrainians, Russians, Poles, Jews, but also a process for the small minorities who wanted to get some political autonomy. And if we consider that, maybe then the combination of the ethnic and civic elements is more complicated and not necessarily working one against the other. It happened to be so. I think there is a desperate moment of Ukrainian nationalism. You know, when Bandera said, we are against everybody. I think it's around 43, something like that. But this is not the, I mean, the dominant ethos of the nation. It's, I would say, a moment of desperation, because nothing worked. Alliance with the Germans, alliance with the Poles, everybody betrayed us, blah, blah, blah. But this is an exception rather than the rule of Ukrainian nationalism.
Thank you. You may answer.
Very quickly, I totally agree. Right? So the historical picture is much more complicated. This dynamic between ethnic and civic in all nations is much more complicated than I just schematically proposed. So I think if you look at it very precisely, you will see that from the moment nations begin, there's also a civic articulation of that from its beginning, all the time. So it's more like how it shifts through time. And then you could call Bandera then a kind of regression to a very ethnic idea, not just in time, but in Zagreb, to quote my colleague. So we agree, I think, about the historical details.
You want to make another one?
Well, but I think Obama proceeds to majority. Okay. Well,
if it's continuous, I suppose it's continuous for discussion.
Only
I remember about your question.
Only one remark. There might emerge other problems on the way of Ukraine to the European Union. Because I think most Germans, I only can speak for the Germans, most Germans would welcome Ukraine as a member of the European Union. The problems on this way are well known. The arrangement with Russia, that's a real problem. But I think there might emerge new problems on the way to the European Union, but the old problems might lose some of their weight, because that's the way every member of the European Union, every nation has to go the way to another civic unit. I wouldn't say a new civic nationalism, but a civic union, which is not very well defined to now.
Thank you. Еще.
Very much. No. Very quickly.
I suppose if you say yeah, I suppose it's been
No. Very quickly. Two things. One is there was this wonderful moment when Maidan started, right? Which nobody expected. Nobody in this room expected Maidan to happen, actually, and then it did. And it did because Yanukovych refused to sign the treaty with the EU. And it were the students, the people who saw their future taken away, who went to the street, right? And then the older generations came after them. And this was so beautiful because at that moment, Ukraine was the most European nation of Europe. Ukraine was the only one who really understood the EU and what it stands for. And it were the young people of the Ukraine. We have never had in the history of the EU demonstrations with the European flag. We have never had that, right?
And people dying under the European flag.
Exactly. We have never had this. So in some sense, in answer to you, this is the most European country of Europe. So in another sense, and that is in terms of nationalism, I think there is coming into the world a third form of nationalism, and that is cosmopolitan nationalism. That is understanding that you are a nation as a part of a union of other democratic nations that in the end, hopefully, will cover the world, right? And in that sense, the EU has the name of a European Union, but what it actually is a union of democratic nations that started in Europe, right? And not necessarily will end there. So, yeah, I totally agree with you that forces you to think over the civic idea of the nation, beyond.
Уважаемые коллеги, один вопрос, если можно, вы знаете, что из-за стола надо вставать немного голодным, а дискуссию прекращать тогда, когда вопросы еще остались. Поэтому еще один вопрос, пожалуйста, был, и на этом мы перейдем к следующему докладу.
Спасибо за доклад. У меня вопрос такого плана. Вы сказали о том, что украинская нация сформировалась 25 лет назад, и что
Государство.
Да, второй вопрос, можно?
Под нацией
Вы сказали,
народ, обладающий своим
что
государством.
язык — это
Под
очень
нацией
важная часть современного процесса формирования нации. И он имеет два аспекта. Первый аспект — это возможность говорить на своем родном языке для национальных меньшинств, а второй — это обязанность этих меньшинств хотя бы бегло говорить на государственном языке, на украинском языке. Да, такой вопрос. Значительная часть.
Уже, по-моему, с ним например,
Первая часть
вопроса. Первая здесь первая часть. Вопрос в том, что языковой вопрос решится только тогда, когда будет не только дана возможность общаться национальным меньшинством на своем языке родном, но при этом они обязаны будут знать государственный украинский язык. Значительная часть не хочет государственный язык учить, как это можно изменить.
This is actually deeply political, right? And it has to do with how you create a nation. So I would completely agree with you that it would be a kindness gift of the other other groups in Ukraine that speak different languages if they learn Ukrainian fluently. That would be a gift, a nice gift, maybe even an important gift. But if you force people to do that, it loses its character of a gift and becomes divisive. So language is the way we enter the world. You are not to tell me in which language I will enter the world. You will not even tell me that I need to have this specific language to relate to the world. What you have to trust is that the others will voluntarily engage with that language that is the national language.
Добровольно сделать.
Yeah, and if you still have a question, you can ask your question after the next report. Спасибо большое.